Welcome to the Better Wealth Podcast, Enlightened Discipline. I'm Matt Halloran, and I'll be your host for this podcast, and I'm joined today, as always, by Scott Stauffer, an experienced financial advisor who is a designated CFP, or Certified Financial Planner, and the managing partner of Better Wealth. This podcast is brought to you by Better Wealth, located in California's Silicon Valley, serving individual investors and companies from around the United States. Today's podcast is going to be on a hotly contested thing in the financial services industry called an investment policy statement. And there are a lot of different ways to look at the investment policy statement. And Scott today is going to talk to us a lot about what this should be instead of what it might have been presented to you in the past. So good morning, Scott. How are you?
Great, Matt. Good morning.
Well, fantastic, man. Let's dive right in and tell us what an investment policy statement is and why it's so important to the client.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess one of the things. Well, let me tell a story first. One of the programs on NPR is called What I Believe. It's been around for, I think in different forms since the 1950s, and it's a great little way for accountants or attorneys or school teachers or delivery men, whoever it is, to sort of share what are their core values. What are the things that they lean on when times get tough? Things that they may have learned over the years from their families, from their jobs, from their experiences. It's a really neat program. So I've always thought that the investment policy statement should really be sort of what is your it's what you believe about your financial goals and investments and what you're going to do or not do to get to your financial goals. So this IPS should really be something that shows the value of having these overarching goals or set of beliefs about your journey, your financial goals, your investments that you're going to use, and then it helps you get there. So another way to think about it is it's just a roadmap. Right? So before you start your journey, you can identify what are some of the things that you need to really have on your journey, and it can be, sort of that roadmap for you. It's funny, before we had GPS, where everything was on our phones, you used to have to, I remember when my parents, when we were getting ready to go on a trip, we would go to the local AAA office and get all the local maps of the areas that we were going to go to. And, we'd figure out what roads we were going to take, where we were going to stop, sort of plan out the journey. So it's sort of the same thing for your investment goals. It's sitting down and planning out your journey ahead of time and setting up some boundaries so that you're going to stay on track.
This is not normal, though. I want our listeners to really understand that. You're talking about a user-friendly investment policy statement, and that's not actually what most investment policy statements are that you would get from a regular Wall Street type big branch broker advisor. So can you give us some contrast, please?
Yeah, that's, unfortunately, I think Wall Street has made it really difficult to use an investment policy statement. There's an appropriate use, I think, for large endowments and foundations where there's a committee that might be meeting to talk about what those investment goals should be. But in the case of the individual investor, so many times I see these investment policy statements where they're 10, 20, 30, 40 pages long. There's just a ton of jargon and investment speak in there, and in many ways they're just cookie cutter templates. I really think they're designed more about compliance and making sure that the advisor doesn't get in trouble or doesn't set him or herself up to be sued, rather than making it something real that the investor can do. The idea is that if we follow with this analogy of a roadmap, on our journey that we're going to do, there's going to be a lot of distractions. You're going to have flat tires. You're going to have to stop and get your car repaired sometimes. You might make a wrong turn. Your investment policy statement wants to give you the information to know what to do in those situations. And you plan that out ahead of time. So unfortunately, with these long documents that people have, there's nothing real in there that lets you know what to do when you get off track or what to do when market volatility comes. So I've stepped back and created what I think are the 7 key parts or key components to an investment policy statement. And then that's what we try to work on with our clients.
So you break it down into 7 parts. So instead of having it be legalese, which is what most of the IPS's investment policy statements that I've seen look like, you're breaking this down into actionable items. And I love the AAA analogy. Now, you and I are obviously dating ourselves talking about that, because I remember that too. I remember being a delivery driver and having an actual physical map that I had to somehow not drive off the road. People always talk about texting and driving, but I'm telling you, man, when I looked at a map, I was all over the road too. But so you break these down into 7 different parts. So talk to me about what is the main focus, which I'm assuming is your number one.
Yeah. And again, this is what I think, the investment policy statement should look like. And in many ways, it's a combination of a couple different things that we use for individual investors. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start off with, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? And you need to be somewhat specific, and I want them to be measurable as well. Lots of times, it's not as difficult as you think. There are going to be goals around retirement. When do you want to retire? Where do you want to retire? Other things like that. There are going to be maybe some goals you have around college savings if you have kids that are going to be going to college. There might be some goals around traveling. There are going to be some goals around how you're going to age, together with your partner, how you're going to take care of those perhaps long-term care needs. So the first part is really identifying, these are our long-term goals. This is what we want to accomplish, and then this is where we want to go. Then the second part is stepping back and sort of saying, okay, if that's where we want to go, these are all the resources that we have. So it's really looking at what we might call a net worth statement. It's just listing all of your assets, maybe some of the liabilities you have, a mortgage, maybe a car loan or some other things. But it's really just trying to get a snapshot of what are all the resources we have available. You want to make sure you include your different investment accounts, savings accounts, the ones that are that are going to be taxable, the ones that are qualified, or what we call tax deferred accounts. It's going to look at all those different things, because you're getting ready to go on a long trip and you need to know, okay, what resources do I have? So after you've identified your goals and after you've sort of outlined what your resources are, you're going to start to really look at what are the controllable items that you have. I sort of call it your action items or your action list, because here we're going to have identified, maybe from some retirement projection planning work, what are your savings goals? If you have a retirement plan at work, maybe a 401k or a 403b if you're a teacher or work at a nonprofit, or maybe an IRA, right? Or maybe even stock options or restricted stock units that you might have from your companies. You're going to look at, okay, what are our savings goals and what do we need to be doing on an annual basis? These are the things we can really control. If it's maybe later on in retirement for you, you might be looking at, instead of savings goals, you might be looking at spending goals. What are my withdrawal strategies? So again, the first step is coming in and saying, what are my goals? Where do I want to go? What are my resources? What are my controllable action items? What are the things I can do that help me get farther on my journey? Then the fourth part of it is really stepping back and sort of saying, okay, if this is where I want to go, if these are the resources I have, how fast do I want to get there on this trip? What do I feel comfortable with? So what we're talking about here is your risk tolerance. And it's really more than just a questionnaire you may have done. It's what I call it's a way to capture what your emotional ability is and your financial capacity to take risks. And that's so we're talking about figuring out some of the aspects of your asset allocation. How much are you going to have in stocks? How much are you going to have in bonds? And what that rate of return will provide for you on your trip. And this is what I think most traditional investment policy statements spend their time on. They spend their time on allocating in all kinds of details what your allocation should be. And your IPS as an individual investor doesn't need to have all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're talking about deep philosophical questions here, right? I mean, you're not messing around. And I want our listeners to really grasp that idea that you're talking about real life actionable items instead of an investment policy statement being this ethereal thing that is just another piece of paper a financial advisor gives you. And even when we're just talking about, I'm going to say number 1 and number 3, so your goals and your controllable items, those two things, Scott, you have to be a different kind of advisor to be able to initiate that different kind of conversation. So would you mind talking to our listeners a little bit more about how you had this epiphany and how you have this conversation? Because these are tough questions, and a lot of listeners might think, man, I don't know if I'm ready or if I can even answer some of these questions Scott's talking about today.
Yeah, I think that in that sense, we become more of a coach for our clients, where we're really sitting down and helping them. Sometimes people say, yeah, I want to retire, but after that, they just don't have a lot of details. And so it's a matter of asking questions, listening, probing, really trying to help people become more aligned with what they want to accomplish. I think in our industry, and Matt, just a little plug here. We're going to talk about this in our next podcast, which is how do you find a good coach to work with, or how do you find a good financial advisor to work with? I think in our industry, there's just been too much focus on products and not enough focus on quality advice. So we tend to focus more on the quality advice. And so this investment policy statement is really one of the key things that we need to spend time working on. After we've gone through step 4, where we've identified again, what your risk tolerance is, how fast you want to go, sort of that behavioral finance component to this. Then we're going to work with you a little bit on the rule book. It's what I call step 5 is, is really writing down the details about the fees and expenses that you're going to have along the way with your investments. Writing down a little bit about taxes and what are the short-term and long-term impact of taxes on your journey. Understanding what the investment philosophy is that your financial advisor uses. That's really important. Identifying the roles and responsibilities. How often are we going to check in on this investment policy statement? And that's one thing that I think is so important. It's almost as if when we meet with our clients, the investment policy statement is really what guides all of our interactions, all of our discussions, all of our appointments. And so in identifying those roles and responsibilities, we want to know, what's the client responsibility? What's the advisor responsibility? We also want to identify if there's any restrictions in the investment philosophy or in the investments that we may use. We also want to identify who are some of the people that are going to help us along this journey, whether that be your tax preparation person, an estate planning attorney, maybe somebody who helps you with insurance planning. So really what we're trying to do in the first 5 steps is really, again, identify your goals, talk about your resources, look at your controllable action items, talk about the allocation and the rate of return that we're going to need and your risk tolerance, come up with our rule book, because step number 6
Well, hold on. I want to pause you there before you get to step 6, because you're on a roll here, and you just said 2 different things that we have to circle back to. So the first one is you're talking about what you can control and what you can't. And an investment policy statement in the past would be talking a lot more about investments and things like that, which are outside of your control. Now, Scott, I know that you're going to agree with me on this because you can't control the market. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
So you want not only you with your investment policy statement that you work with a client, but you also want your clients to understand what you can control and what you can't. And I think that is a really, really big difference. But you also said something here in number 5, which is your rule book, when you talked about the different details and the different sections of that rule book, but you said restrictions, if any. And I don't really understand what that means. So what do you mean? What is a client going to tell you that could possibly be a restriction?
So sometimes with a client, it might be a company stock that they already have so much assets in that they're trying to diversify over the long run, that there may be a restriction in the portfolio that we're not going to buy any more of that one company stock. It may be in a restriction that we put as a financial advisor. There's just certain things we won't do in terms of specific investments, whether that's, in our particular case, whether that's options trading, whether it might be hedge funds or other things like that. There's some certain things that we just don't believe in. And so like a client who has their own investment policy statement, they're what I believe about their journey. As a financial advisor, I have my own what I believe. And that's essentially, what our website is about. And when we meet with clients, we try to talk about those things. But that the restrictions are really, it's 2 ways. It's what the client might have, can be a company stock, could be some bad experiences that they've had that we need to know about. And it can also be those similar kinds of things that we may have as an advisor, which I think are important to identify and get on the investment policy statement.
So this also gives you the great opportunity to and you just really launched us right into your plan for bad weather, which is number 6. So,
Yeah.
so with the rule book and everything, and again, bad weather is a very subjective thing. And I'm going to just very quick digression here. I live in Michigan, right? And I know you don't. And, it's 42 degrees here. So if it was 42 degrees where you live, what would happen?
We would all be gathering around the fireplace and not knowing what to do, right?
Yeah, my kids wore shorts to school today. So that's not me being a bad parent. It's just Michigan is very, very different. So that's my rule book, right? That's a different rule book than you live by. And I love the fact that you bring that up as a financial professional and a CFP, that you are going to be flexible. Now, there are parts that you're going to put parameters on, right? Which you just talked about. There are certain things that you don't do, but it's good to have that conversation with the clients and what they're not going to do either. So let's launch into number 6. So I'm going to recap real quick. Number 1 was your goals. Number 2, your resources. Number 3, your controllable items. Your number 4, your desired rate of return. Number 5, which is your rule book. And these are the 7 parts of an IPS. So what's number 6?
Yeah, it's your plan for bad weather. We always know that bad weather is coming. It absolutely is. There's no question. We just don't know when. And so what are you going to do if the market drops 10%? How does your investment policy inform your decision? Because you want to have a plan for bad weather. What are you going to do if the market drops 20%? Are you going to change your allocation? Are you going to take a detour? Are you going to step off the road for a little bit? Now, you might not want to do those things. They might not be in your best long-term interest. But if there's something that happens, I think having a plan for that bad weather is going to make it easier to know what to do so that you're not reacting in the moment. That's where the investment media really does us a disfavor sometimes, when the market takes those normal drops, those normal corrections that we have, and we've talked about that in other podcasts. Sometimes the headlines are, doom and gloom, and you don't need to be responding to that. You need to understand that you've got a long-term journey, and you want to be focused on that, not the short-term items. You also want to know what's going to happen if there's a sudden change in your life. Maybe it's unemployment. Maybe it's unexpected needs from some of your kids. Who knows what it might be, but you want to have a plan for those items that might come up in terms of bad weather. And I think having it written down, having it discussed with your advisor is really critical, because then when it happens, you know what you're going to do.
Scott, you said earlier about behavioral finance, and we have talked about that in podcasts past on these Better Wealth Enlightened Discipline podcasts. But if you wouldn't mind, let's circle back to that for a minute, because bad weather is when most consumers, most clients of yours, or most people who are they're not clients of yours, they're do-it-yourselfers, let's just be honest. That's when they freak out, right? So how does your plan for bad weather really bring us back to that rate of return and behavioral finance?
Well, I think what it does is it shows us what long-term results have been in the past, and how we might be able to understand what's going to happen going forward. And again, it's those controllable action items. It's just really understanding the ups and downs of the journey that you're going to have, knowing that sometimes you're going to hit some traffic jams. And when you hit that traffic jam, you've always seen, the lane next to you seems like it's going faster. And so you get over into the other lane, you make a change. And then next thing you know, the lane that you just left is going on by, right? And so what you don't want to do is do that with your investments. You don't want to be, buying and selling and trying to make changes in the moment. You've got a long-term plan. We know we might hit some traffic jams, but don't be, changing and going over to the fast lane just to try to catch up when you know that your lane's going to get there just as fine. So I think, understanding that behavioral finance component to this, again, writing it down is really critical. It's just understanding that you have a plan for when things don't go as you expected.
So how often do you sit down with your clients and review their investment policy statement?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because our investment policy statement is really a combination of about 3 or 4 different things that I think a lot of firms might use. And so, because it is that, it's really the number one thing that we're looking at in every appointment. So when we get together with clients, we're sort of saying, hey, here's that investment policy statement, we've talked about, and let's look at that. Let's reaffirm where we're at. Now, we might go off and look at some other tangents, but that's our main thing that we're looking at and where we start from in every appointment. In terms of the nuts and bolts, you also want to make sure, this is step 7, the last one. You want to have 2 things, what I call is your checkup and your backup plan. So, how often are you going to check the status of this? So even though we might look at it every appointment, how many times a year are we going to get together and look at this? Is it semi-annual appointments? Is it, 3 appointments a year? How many times are we going to check in face, or are we going to check in over the phone or on Skype or something like that? Mm-hmm. How many times are we going to be looking at rebalancing? We've had a great podcast on rebalancing already that I'll refer you back to, but essentially with rebalancing, you want to be looking at the portfolio, every couple weeks, but you really don't want to rebalance it, maybe once or twice a year. Mm-hmm. So as long as you have that in your IPS, that's great. And then I always say the backup plan too is a part of number 7, because what happens if you can't finish the trip? So we do want to make sure that we've identified and let clients know about, their resources that they have devoted to life insurance, disability insurance, maybe some benefits provided by their employer, other things like that. So in sum, this investment policy statement is really sort of looking at, hey, this is where I'm going. These are the supplies I need to get there. This is what I need to do along the way to get there. These are the roads and the speeds we're going to take. These are the rules we're going to follow. If we hit bad weather, this is our plan. And this is when we're going to stop and check in to get gas, change our oil, get some food, other things like that. So I think if investors had that, wow, I think that's a lot more meaningful in terms of understanding where they're trying to go and how they're going to get there than these 20, 30-page documents that are a lot more legalese and a lot more CYA for the advisor than they are for something real for the client.
Scott, you've taken us through these 7 steps and told us what should be in an investment policy statement and what really does separate you from the other advisor down the street. But what is not in an IPS? So you've talked about all the stuff that should be there. Now, can you give us an idea on what shouldn't or isn't necessary to be in an IPS?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Matt. I think the investment policy statement in some ways needs to be the 30,000 elevation, view. It's not going to have all the individual details. We're not going to be able to identify, specific withdrawal strategies in retirement, or, how different accounts behave and how some might have one allocation compared to a different allocation. So it's not a detailed financial plan. It's not a detailed retirement projection that you might have. It's taking the sort of key items from those other reports and putting it into a living document that I think, you can look at when things are going well, when things aren't going well, or just to reaffirm. So it's not, you have those other reports that you should have and that you've spent in great detail analyzing and with your advisor, but it's not the investment policy statement.
It seems pretty straightforward, right? And it not only beneficial to you as a financial advisor, because, if bad weather happens or there's a hiccup or they hear a headline, you can have this be almost like a hard reset button, right? Scott, you can say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, we just, let's grab your IPS and let's talk about this because, this is why we built this IPS. My question is, why aren't other advisors using an IPS or creating an IPS like you are talking about today?
Yeah, again, I think it really has to do with compliance, and we're going to talk about this on our next podcast when we talk about, how you should identify a coach or a teacher to really help you with some of this. But as a little sort of intro into that, it's really what I call the difference between the suitability standard and the fiduciary standard. Now, those are sometimes hard words to understand in our industry, but it's really the difference between being product focused with a solution for a client and being advice focused. So,
well, which one's which? Hold on. Yeah, give us more on that.
Well, if you are, a lot of structures in our industry are set up to where you have to identify whether a different product that you may use for a client is suitable for them. Whereas other structures in our industry are set up to be, is this in the best interest of my client ahead of myself? A lot of it has to do with how advisors are compensated, but a lot of it has to do with the structures that are set up. And so I guess my point is that sometimes the structures historically in Wall Street or in broker-dealer firms or even for different advisors, the structures are set up such that they have a role to do only what is suitable for a client, not necessarily what's in the client's best interest. And as a result, they have a compliance function that works to support that. And so sometimes that investment policy statement might have something in there that might not be as product friendly as what a fiduciary role might be. Because in a fiduciary role, we're standing back and we're looking first at where do you want to go, how are you going to get there, what are the resources you have, all those different things. And then we're saying, okay, now what are the things that can really help you on your journey, versus somebody else sort of saying, here's something that we should start with, here's a product, and now the compliance function is all about making sure that you're suitable for that. And in many ways, the IPS has grown up out of this industry that says, really, this is much more about, well, here's the product that we have, and this product now has these limitations. Mm-hmm. So let's identify how we're going to manage these limitations in an investment policy statement and have all this legalese in here. And so it's sort of, the investment policy statement has sort of become something else that sort of says, hey, really what we're doing is we're managing expectations of our product that you're using, not managing expectations of the journey of where you want to go. And I think that's a fundamental point of view difference. And that's what we're going to talk about in selecting the right financial advisor.
So give us the 7 parts of an IPS again, and let's just run through those real quick before we wrap up today.
Yeah. So again, your first step is identifying your goals. Number 2 is identifying your resources that you have. Number 3 is identifying your controllable action items. I love that. Number 4 is understanding the allocation and the desired rate of return that you're going to use to get to your journey, how fast you're going to go, how slow. The rule book is going to talk about some of the details about fees and expenses, really important things in our industry too. Number 6 is your plan for bad weather. And number 7 is how often are you going to check up, and also your backup plan.
Fantastic. So before we leave, would you mind sharing with our listeners today how they can get in contact with you directly? And then I'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, sure, Matt. We have our website, www.betterwealth.us. So that's the best place to go. You can give us a call and send an email. One of the things that I've done always in my career is what I call the complimentary second opinion service. Mm-hmm. There's lots of times where I'm just sitting down with somebody on a phone call who may or may not be interested in working with us. And, we're just happy to give them some advice, have them get to know us a little bit. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine too. Happy to pay it forward a little bit, if you will. So give us a call and send us an email, and we'll be happy to talk about your personal situation.
Fantastic. That's it for today's Better Wealth podcast. I'm Matt Halloran for Scott Stauffer. Please make sure to follow us at betterwealth.us. And when you're ready to have an advisor who is focused on doing what works better for your success, Scott and his team are available to chat in person, on the phone, or on a video conference. Have a wonderful day.